The fine notice was duct taped to my front gate like a ransom letter. Red ink, bold letters. Final notice, $15,000 fine for unapproved construction. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd I assumed it had to be a prank. My name's Trent Barlow. I moved back to this old property 2 years ago after my dad passed. He left me the land, the house, and the big red barn that's been here since 1952, stamped in concrete on the foundation, plain as day. The barn was older than the HOA itself, which conveniently formed in 2003 when a bunch of retirees decided they wanted to start bossing people around. I never joined, didn't have to. My property's been grandfathered out since before any of them even lived here. But that never sat well with Nancy Zellner. Nancy is the HOA president. Mid-50s, thick shellacked hair, and the kind of permanent scowl that could sour milk. She drives around in a beige golf cart with a clipboard and a walkie-talkie like she's running a prison camp. Always wears blouses with shoulder pads and talks like she's auditioning for a courtroom drama. She showed up exactly 30 minutes after I found the notice. Parked her golf cart right in front of my barn like it was a crime scene. "Trent," she called out, stepping out and adjusting her glasses. "We need to have a serious conversation." I crossed my arms, standing in the shade of the barn. "About what? You trying to fine me 15 grand over a building that's older than you?" Her lips pursed like she bit a lemon. "We received reports of recent construction. This barn isn't on any of our approved documents. Because it predates your little neighborhood dictatorship by half a century," I said. "It's original, built by my grandfather in '52. Want to see the date on the foundation?" she huffed. "We don't rely on anecdotal evidence, we have forms." "This structure wasn't submitted for architectural review, and that's a violation." I stared at her. "Nancy, you can't fine me for a building that's been standing for 70 years. She pointed her pen at me like it was a sword. "We have bylaws. And your lack of cooperation is being noted." "You don't have jurisdiction," I shot back. "My parcel isn't even under HOA control." She smiled tight, forced, teeth barely showing. "That's being reconsidered." I blinked. "What?" "There's a proposed amendment to expand the HOA boundary to include outlying properties. 40% approval and it goes into effect." "You can't retroactively pull me into your circus," I said. She turned, walking toward her cart. "We'll see what the committee decides." As she drove off, I noticed something strange. Her little clipboard had photos of my barn, not just the exterior but close-ups of the new paint job I did last fall, the new gutter I installed, the solar-powered lights I added out back. Harmless upgrades, all of them, nothing structural. But in the hands of someone like Nancy, they were ammunition. Something told me she wasn't just trying to find me. She was trying to take control of my land, and I wasn't about to let that happen. HOA story, HOA stories, Homeowners Association stories. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions. But I also didn't believe in coincidences, especially not when they showed up with a clipboard and a pre-written fine. That night, I pulled out the original deed and property plat from my dad's file cabinet. Everything was there. The barn was clearly marked on the 1953 survey, and there were scanned copies of county records confirming its existence even earlier. I made copies, then backups of the copies. Then I emailed the files to myself and stashed a USB drive in the garage freezer, just in case. The next morning, I went down to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the counter, a sharp-eyed type named Darlene, leaned in when I told her what I was dealing with. "Trying to fine you for that barn," she said, scrolling through digital records on her screen. "That's been on file since Eisenhower. What are they even using to justify that? Claiming it's a new construction," I said. "They've got photos of the paint job I did in September." Darlene rolled her eyes. "Typical. They think new coat means new build. We've been getting more of these HOA overreach complaints lately. Some of them are trying to annex land just for the dues." "Is that even legal?" She tapped her keyboard, then pointed at a section of county development code. Only if the property owners vote to join, you'd have to sign a formal consent. If they're trying to override that, they're crossing into coercion. I left with certified copies of everything. Survey maps, historical registration, even a letter from the zoning office confirming the barn's grandfathered status. I figured I'd get my ducks in a row before Nancy came back swinging. She didn't wait long. That Friday, while I was tightening the hinges on the back gate, a man in a blue windbreaker strolled up the driveway. Tall, balding, glasses. Introduced himself as Curtis Hargrove, Architectural Review Consultant for the HOA. "Mind if I take a look around the structure?" he asked, already eyeing the roofline. "You're not stepping a foot past that gravel," I said. "This is private property, you're not county, you're not code enforcement." Curtis adjusted his glasses. "The HOA asked me to assess unauthorized modifications. There's been a report of structural expansion." "You mean the motion lights I put in? Or the gutters I replaced? They're welcome to squint at those from the sidewalk." He hesitated, then pulled a folder from his bag and handed it to me. Inside were full-color photos, time-stamped, showing the barn from multiple angles, including one from behind the property, where there's no public access. I stared at the last page. It was a close-up shot, taken through my back fence. The kind of angle you'd get if you were standing on the neighbor's shed roof. "Who took these?" I asked, flipping the page. Curtis shrugged. "Anonymous submission." I narrowed my eyes. "That photo was taken from private land. If someone climbed a fence to get that, they committed trespassing." "I'm just here to evaluate," he said, already stepping back toward the road. That night, I installed 2 more security cameras, one facing the alley, the other aimed at my back fence. The next morning, I caught a figure skulking behind the property line. Hoodie, phone out, snapping more pictures. I called the sheriff. Deputy Keller showed up 20 minutes later, big guy with a slow drawl and a take-no-nonsense attitude. I showed him the footage, pointed out the time-stamped photos, and handed over a copy of the file Curtis had dropped off. "Looks like someone's been hopping fences," he said. "Think it's someone from the HOA?" He scratched his chin. "Wouldn't be the first time a board member got overzealous. Can't press charges without ID, but I can file a report. If they come back, call us again and we'll escalate." I nodded. "I'm guessing this doesn't happen in just my neighborhood. You'd be surprised how many of these associations think they're above the law," he said. "They forget the county still exists." Things quieted down for a few days. Then the real fireworks started. A notice arrived in the mail, certified this time. Not from the HOA, but from a law firm called Haskins and Levier. It claimed I was in default of association rules and subject to lien proceedings. Attached was a fabricated ledger showing escalating fines, now totaling $21,000. They'd added daily penalties for non-compliance. I drove straight to the county courthouse. The clerk directed me to the civil division, where I met a woman named Farah. She took one look at the documents and shook her head. "They can't file a lien unless you're part of the HOA, and even then, only after exhausting internal dispute resolution and arbitration. This skips all that. It's legally hollow." I handed over the certified property records, the grandfathering clause, and the zoning letter. She flipped through them, nodding. "They're bluffing. But if they try to file anything with the county, we'll have this on record." I left the courthouse and called a friend of mine, Jeffrey Lang, a land use attorney I'd gone to high school with. He owed me a favor from a time when I pulled his truck out of a ditch during a snowstorm. Jeffrey met me at the diner that evening. Once he saw the documents, he leaned back in the booth and let out a low whistle. "They're trying to build a case with sand," he said. "This isn't just overreach. If they're forging financial records and threatening liens without authority, that's fraud." "What's the move?" he grinned. "We're going to hit them with a cease and desist. Then we file a complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Protection. If they've sent similar threats to anyone else, this becomes a pattern and patterns get investigated." The next morning, we did exactly that. Jeffrey drafted a letter that made my spine tingle just reading it. Every threat, every false claim, every bit of harassment documented and presented with legal citations. We mailed it, emailed it, and hand-delivered a copy to the HOA Dropbox, just for good measure. 3 days later, I got an email from a resident named Maria from 2 streets over. She'd gotten a nearly identical fine for repainting her fence, claimed it was unapproved color deviation. She asked if I was taking action. I told her I was. Within a week, Jeffrey had received emails from 5 more homeowners, all with similar stories. Inflated fines. Vague accusations. Threats of liens. We held a backyard meeting under the string lights behind my barn. Chairs pulled together, coffee in thermoses, printouts of HOA bylaws and county ordinances spread across folding tables. People were angry, but more importantly, they were ready. Maria brought a spreadsheet. Turns out she worked in compliance for a financial firm. She tracked every fine issued in the last 6 months and spotted a pattern. 70% of them were issued to homes not attending HOA meetings. Half were seniors. A few were new residents. "They're targeting people who won't fight back," she said. That's when I knew this wasn't about my barn. This was about control. And Nancy had picked the wrong guy to try to bulldoze. The next step wasn't just defending my land. It was exposing the entire house of cards. And I had the people, the documents, and now a lawyer in my corner. Nancy wanted a war over a paint job. She was about to get an audit. By the end of the 2nd week, the group had grown from a handful of frustrated neighbors to nearly 2 dozen. The backyard meetings became more organized, with folding tables weighed down by manila folders, highlighters, and copies of documents that had no business being in the hands of an HOA. The group began referring to themselves, half-jokingly, as the unfined. But it stopped being a joke the moment someone brought up the bank letters. "I got a call from my mortgage lender," said Alan, a retired paramedic who lived 2 houses down from Maria. "They said a lien had been filed on my property. I asked for a copy, and guess what? It's from the HOA. They filed it directly with the title office." Jeffrey leaned over the table, flipping through the scanned documents Alan had brought. "Did you get any notice from the HOA before this?" "Nope. Just the same fine notice everyone else got. I ignored it, figured it was nonsense. Then the lender called." Jeffrey's eyes narrowed. "They skipped due process. That's not just a civil violation, that's mail fraud and unauthorized encumbrance. If we can prove they filed false claims with the county, they're in serious criminal territory." Maria stood and pointed at a section of the notes she'd organized on her laptop. "I've got 4 others with similar stories. None of them got any arbitration paperwork. Just fines followed by county filings." That shifted the entire tone of the gathering. No more jokes, no more passive resistance. It was clear now Nancy and the HOA board weren't just playing tough. They were breaking the law. Jeffrey left that night with a stack of affidavits under his arm. The next morning, he filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office and submitted a packet to the county district attorney. He didn't just accuse them of overreach, he laid out a pattern of willful fraud. 2 days later, the sheriff's department returned to my place, but this time, they weren't just responding to a call. They brought an investigator. Detective Marnie Caldwell introduced herself with a firm handshake and a tired voice. "We've had 3 separate reports now of falsified liens from your HOA," she said. "I'm here to figure out how deep this goes." I handed her everything we'd collected so far: the email chains, the photos, the security footage, and the letters from the law firm that had threatened me. Caldwell examined the documents carefully, flipping through the pages with the quiet focus of someone who'd seen worse. "The firm that sent these letters, Haskins and Levier, have they followed up with any formal filings?" "No, just threats. Trying to scare people into paying." She tapped the corner of the letter with her pen. "I'll check whether this firm even exists. If they're using a shell name to send threats, that opens a whole other can of worms." The next morning, Caldwell returned. "You're not going to believe this." she said as she stepped out of her unmarked cruiser. Haskins and Levier is a real firm on paper, but it's not a practicing law office. It's registered to a P.O. box in another county, and the bar numbers listed on the letterhead, both fake. One of them belongs to a deceased traffic court judge. Jeffrey, who'd arrived after receiving a heads-up from Caldwell, spoke first. "So we're talking about impersonating legal authority. That's a felony." "More than one," she confirmed. "Forgery, unauthorized practice of law, fraud, and possibly conspiracy to defraud. We're going to serve a search warrant on the HOA office." The office wasn't much a converted room in Nancy's detached garage, outfitted with a metal desk and some file cabinets. But Caldwell brought a whole team. County deputies, a warrant in hand, and a public notary to document every item removed. Nancy stood on the porch, arms crossed, glaring at me and Jeffrey like we were the ones trespassing. "You're making a mistake," she said to Caldwell. "This is harassment." Caldwell didn't blink. "We have evidence of forged legal documents and fraudulent liens. If you have nothing to hide, you'll cooperate." Nancy didn't move. Jeffrey stepped forward. "You filed claims against homeowners without due process. You attempted to collect under threat of legal action using made-up firms. That's not governance, that's extortion." Nancy turned to me, eyes sharp. "You think you've won something here?" "I think you forgot who you were dealing with," I said. By the time the search was over, 5 file boxes had been confiscated. One of the deputies handed Caldwell a folder labeled "Non-Compliance Escalation List." Inside were spreadsheets showing homeowner names, addresses, fine amounts, and a column labeled "Pressure Points," mortgage lenders, employers, even family members. Caldwell's face stiffened as she read it. "They've been targeting people based on leverage." One column had a note next to Alan's name. "Retired threaten lien to trigger bank involvement." Another next to Maria's. "Single mother mention custody complications if fine unpaid." Jeffrey's voice was ice. They weren't just trying to collect money, they were trying to scare people into submission. That afternoon, Caldwell met with the district attorney. By evening, 3 arrest warrants had been issued for Nancy, the treasurer, and the HOA's so-called compliance officer. They were picked up quietly. No sirens, no cuffs in the street, just a visit, a knock, and a ride in the back of a cruiser. The charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false instruments, and impersonating a legal entity. Word spread fast. By the next morning, over 50 homeowners had shown up at City Hall to file individual complaints. The local news picked up the story. Microphones were shoved toward anyone willing to talk. Maria gave an interview that aired during the evening broadcast, outlining the intimidation tactics the board had used. I stayed out of the spotlight. Not because I was afraid, because this wasn't about me anymore. 2 weeks later, the HOA was officially suspended by the State Oversight Board. A temporary administrator was appointed to audit their records and determine how much restitution would be owed to residents. The barn. It stood untouched, exactly as it had for over 70 years. No more fines, no more threats, no more golf carts parked out front like it was a crime scene. But the best part came in the mail: a certified letter from the county clerk's office. It declared, in no uncertain terms, that my property was permanently exempt from any current or future HOA jurisdiction. Signed, stamped, and sealed. I framed it and hung it inside the barn. Caldwell stopped by one last time a few weeks later. She brought a copy of the final investigation summary, over 100 pages of evidence, testimony, and documentation. It read like a crime novel. "You planning to keep fighting?" she asked. I shook my head. "I'm not looking for trouble. But if it shows up again, I'll be ready," she nodded. "Most people would have paid the fine and moved on. They didn't build this place to be folded under pressure," I said. "Neither did I." She smiled quietly, then handed me her card. "Just in case." Nancy and the others took plea deals. No jail time, but they were barred from serving on any board or managing funds for a community organization ever again. They paid restitution, lost their homes to legal fees, and disappeared from the neighborhood like ghosts. The new administrator dissolved the HOA within 6 months. The residents voted to replace it with a voluntary neighborhood council, no fines, no enforcement powers, just a group that actually listened. The unfined still meet once a month. No agenda, no minutes, just neighbors, coffee, and the occasional potluck. Nobody talks about Nancy anymore. But the barn still stands, solid, quiet, proof that some things can't be bullied down. The barn sat quiet behind me as I sat on my porch that morning, coffee cooling in my hand. A woodpecker hammered away at one of the pines by the creek, and the wind carried the scent of sawdust from the neighbor's new deck construction. Something people could finally do without threat of financial punishment or bogus citations. The state-appointed administrator, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Wu, had been overseeing the HOA's dismantling for 5 weeks. She worked out of a temporary trailer parked at the old community center, and every hour she dug through the mountain of files Nancy and her board had left behind, more damage came to light. Jeffrey kept me posted. He'd been helping residents recover wrongful fines, and he'd taken on pro bono cases for some of the older homeowners who'd lost thousands. One of them, a retired Navy electrician named Russ, had nearly lost his home over a fake violation for visible wiring that turned out to be a solar panel cable tucked neatly under his eave. But the worst came when Karen pulled a set of hard drives from the locked cabinet Nancy called her compliance archive. They weren't just spreadsheets or photos. These held audio recordings, hours of them, of board meetings that had never been disclosed to the public. Private strategy sessions, surveillance discussions, even voice memos between Nancy and the treasurer, Gordon, Jeffrey called after listening to 2 hours' worth. They were discussing how to fabricate evidence, he said, his tone flat. In one clip, Gordon describes photoshopping a shadow onto a photo of someone's fence to make it look taller. Nancy says, "Nobody measures these things. We just need the optics." I didn't respond right away. I was watching a squirrel climb the barn's weather vane where it paused, tail twitching like it was agitated. "They recorded themselves doing this," I said finally. Not just that. They kept files on residents' medical conditions, financial struggles, even marital issues. Nancy refers to it as behavioral leverage. She says if someone pushed back too hard, they'd dangle a threat where it hurts. That same day, Karen filed a formal incident report with the county attorney's office. The recordings were classified as evidence of willful misconduct and targeted exploitation. The sheriff's department returned, this time with a forensic technician who spent 6 hours going through the HOA's digital records. By the following Monday, the county prosecutor held a press conference. I was standing in the back of the crowd, arms folded, as he stepped up to the podium. "We're formally charging former HOA board members Nancy Zellner and Gordon Price with criminal conspiracy, unlawful surveillance, and data exploitation. Additional charges include elder coercion and falsifying public records." A reporter raised her hand. "Is this the first time a neighborhood association has been charged with this type of organized misconduct?" "Yes," the prosecutor said. "This is the first time in this county, and possibly the state, that a homeowners association has been treated as a corrupt organization under RICO statutes. That meant something bigger than individual fines or forged letters. It meant the board had operated like a criminal enterprise and would be prosecuted as such. 2 days later, both Nancy and Gordon were indicted. The state froze their personal and HOA-controlled accounts. The investigation revealed they had funneled nearly $60,000 in compliance fees into a shell company listed under Gordon's nephew's name. That money was used to pay for private investigators, high-end surveillance equipment, and in one case, a drone with a zoom lens that had been flown over backyards without consent. Karen called a final meeting at the community center to update the residents. The room was packed, standing room only. Some people brought folding chairs, others stood in the aisles. Even Caldwell, the detective, showed up in plain clothes and leaned against the back wall. Karen stood at the front beneath a whiteboard dense with bullet points and timelines. We've completed our review of the financial records. We've identified 73 individuals who were fined without due process. 42 of those fines were paired with threats that violated state statutes regarding homeowner protections. She clicked a slide. The screen behind her showed a bar graph of fraudulent fines issued per month. Restitution is being arranged through a state-managed fund. You'll receive letters in the next 2 weeks detailing your individual case and the reimbursement amount. A man near the front raised his hand. What happens to the HOA now? Karen looked over the crowd. It's being dissolved. Permanently? The county has approved a motion to remove the HOA from the subdivision's charter. This neighborhood will operate independently moving forward. You'll still be subject to municipal codes, but no more private enforcement. A murmur of relief swept through the room. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. Maria leaned over to me. "Did you ever think it would go this far?" "No," I said, "but I'm glad it did." Outside, people stayed to talk, exchanging numbers, offering to help one another with yard work or minor repairs. The fear that had hovered over the neighborhood like a wet tarp was gone, replaced with something I hadn't seen here in a long time: trust. The media coverage continued for another week. The story hit regional news, and a state senator called for a review of HOA oversight regulations. Caldwell later told me that 3 other neighborhood associations across the state had requested audits, spooked by what happened here. Nancy and Gordon pled guilty. As part of their plea deal, they were ordered to pay restitution, barred from serving on any civic board indefinitely, and sentenced to probation with mandatory community service. For Gordon, it meant a year of volunteering at a senior center. For Nancy, it meant cleaning roadside ditches with a vest that read "Community Service Court Ordered." On a quiet Friday afternoon, I visited the barn. I'd replaced some of the siding with reclaimed wood from my dad's old storage shed, and the place looked better than it had in years. A small plaque now hung near the door, engraved with a single line: "Built by hand, defended with purpose." Maria and Alan stopped by later with a couple of folding chairs and a 6-pack of root beer. We sat behind the barn, watching the sun dip behind the trees, the air filled with the sound of crickets and the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower. Alan pulled out a small notebook. "Some of us were thinking," he said, "instead of another association, what if we just had a neighborhood co-op? Voluntary. No dues unless we want to chip in for something. No rules unless we all agree on them." Maria nodded. "We've already got enough people interested to start one, and no one wants a board. Just a shared space to talk and help each other out." I took a long sip of root beer, the glass bottle cool against my palm. Sounds like something worth building. That night, I took one last look at that framed exemption letter on the barn wall before heading in. I didn't need to keep it there anymore, not for proof, not for protection. But I left it anyway. It was more than a document, it was a reminder. That when someone tries to tear down what you've built, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still, dig in, and make sure the whole neighborhood sees. And this time they did.